Welcome back to The Comfy Chairs, a podcast from 123 Limited. I'm your host, Kate. This episode marks the first anniversary of The Comfy Chairs, and to celebrate, I've invited my very first guest to join me again. So it seems fitting that our conversation will focus on the reasons why and the ways how leaders can look back and accurately and compassionately assess their own performance. I've spent a lot of time in these comfy chairs talking about self-awareness and empathy. Both of these are vital to evaluating your own performance in a way that is authentic, realistic, and kind. And it can help to get support. That's why I'm offering listeners a chance to win a complimentary Everything Disc assessment. So stay tuned to learn more about this Comfy Chairs birthday gift for you. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Angela, I am so grateful that you're joining me again. It was wonderful having you as the first guest, and I'm just really glad that you agreed to come back for the start of year 2.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation back, Kate. I remember how anxious and out of my comfort zone I was a year ago.
You look much more relaxed in your chair today.
Thank you.
It's been a full year. I know you've had some job changes and family excitement going on. I'm looking forward to us having some time to reflect a little bit. But I thought as a way to start the conversation, I could take a minute and share my own assessment, since we're talking about accurate and compassionate self-assessment of the Comfy Chairs first year. Both my performance as a host, if you will, but then also kind of as a producer and the podcast as a whole. So what's going well, I think, is I set a monthly goal for myself to produce at least 2 episodes each month. And it's been by the skin of my teeth some months, but 100% on that. Something I'm really proud of is the guests have all given me positive feedback about their experiences, and that means a lot to me. What's been challenging, what's not gone quite as well as I would like, consistency. That's been hard overall, not just the scheduling, but building it into a regular weekly practice, since I'm still a one-woman show. Marketing, that's my learning curve. It will be my learning edge for a long time. I will say too, I've become very aware of my verbal pauses and the way I talk. I'm trying to stop some of those, and I know it just slows me down and makes me awkward. So,
well, Kate, what I noticed about what just happened was you went from what has been challenging to exploring your inner critic very quickly. I don't know that anyone has criticized you for your pauses or the way that you talk. For me, someone who knows you, it's very natural for me, and it's not awkward for me at all.
Thank you. Another thing I think is challenging is being relevant and useful. Are we talking about things that matter to people, leaders in particular, or people that are interested in learning more about leadership? And I don't think it's been bad. It's just something I'm aware of and I want to have kind of on my radar. Then I like to think about, what have I learned over that time? What I've learned is that I love doing this. I love the hosting, the conversations. I have been blessed to meet so many new and interesting people. Additional collaborations and work has come out of this process. So getting to expand my network and my personal professional knowledge has been a blast. And then what I think needs to come next is that sustainable process for connecting with new guests and doing scheduling, refining how I'm doing editing, and the big stuff, increasing listenership and the feedback that I receive from listeners. I wanted to start there, not just to do the thing that I'm talking about, but also to share a really simple model that people can follow. When we want to assess ourselves, anytime, any reason, if you look at what's good, what's bad, what's the lesson, and what can the future look like, fast. It's taken me less than 5 minutes to do this, right?
Yes.
There are lots of ways to go about this. So I think where I'd like us to start in our conversation is, what are the essential elements of a balanced and realistic evaluation of one's own results?
Go.
Go. Well, we can cover the basics, the who, what, why, how, and when of things.
Before I go there,
Okay.
I want to back up. When you were talking about your very simple model,
Mm-hmm.
what I noticed when you talked about what you learned was you naturally talked about what gave you joy through this process.
Yeah.
And when we're doing that self-assessment, one of the most important things is not just to look outward as far as what are the external results, how are other people responding and reacting, but how does this also contribute to my inner joy and my self-care too?
Yeah.
And so I really just appreciated that happened really naturally for you.
Thank you. Well, it has definitely been a bright spot. Starting your own business, starting a show like this, lots of things to learn, lots of challenges, lots of missteps, and there is joy in it. The people that I'm meeting, different ways of doing the sorts of work that we do as leaders, as people on my part. I've not had a bad experience in the last year, and to every guest and person who's said, "Hey, I heard your podcast," thank you for that. I do not take it lightly.
Yeah. So back to your question.
Back to the question.
The essentials of a balanced self-assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's start with the word self.
Yep.
So when we're trying to do a genuine self-assessment, while we consider feedback that we've gotten from others, while we consider what we're hearing from others, we really need to be sure that we're evaluating also what I think and what I believe. So it's taking into consideration the opinion of others, but it's not just regurgitating the opinion of others.
Yeah.
You have to take that information in and then synthesize it to come up with, what do I think the outcome of that is? So it's not what everyone else is saying about the work.
Yeah. I think talking about the self in that is really important, because that is the thing, right? I also think this isn't something that's unique to people that hold formal leadership positions. I also think it's not explicitly for the workplace. This is something that we all can do, and we can do it for long periods of time. Like, let me look back over the last year, whether it's your birthday, whether it's an anniversary, whether it's New Year's, and ask yourself, did I show up the way I wanted to? Did I get the results that I wanted? What have I heard about how I was? And it's definitely, in fact, I would say, I'm going to claim it is a mandate for people in formal leadership roles who have direct reports and are responsible for performance outcomes, that you need to be assessing yourself, not just your numerical quantitative results, but how am I doing as a leader of people? But it's not exclusively the purview of people in leadership. Why do you think it matters? I'm saying it's a mandate.
Yes, you did. You did. You did say it was a mandate. And I was thinking about the why. We jumped into the self-assessment, and it's like, well, why do I want to commit to doing this anyway? Every single one of us, everyone who is listening to this podcast, wants to continue to grow and change and get better at all of the things throughout life. We want to improve the relationships that we have with one another. We want to continue to grow and to nurture those. We want the people around us to feel valued and heard. And so when you talk about it being a leadership mandate, it is the ability to continue to connect with others and for others to perceive us as being effective.
I'm jumping around a little bit in the questions I'd shared with you. But I think you're raising a point that's important in this conversation about should we be transparent with other people about our self-assessment? You're talking about it as a way to connect, which implies I'm letting people know that I've done this. In sharing a personal assessment of your own performance, of your own behaviors, it can be very easy to end up monopolizing the conversation.
Yeah.
So what are ways that we can be transparent with people, but do it in a fashion that does create connection?
Yeah, I think that is a good question. And what comes to mind for me when we think about transparency is moderation is key. Everything is good in moderation.
Oh, that's a great point.
It's important for me to be transparent for two reasons. Number one, that level of transparency allows others to see my humanness in a different way. My ability to acknowledge things that I've done well, things that didn't go well for me or that I'm not doing so well. What have I learned and what could the future look like? Serves as an opportunity for me to look more human. At the same time, it models that behavior for the rest of the team or for the rest of those people that I'm interacting with so that they learn that mindset and that process as well. I've also experienced where we overshare. And so, while yes, I want others to know my humanness and to know my innermost being. I don't want to share to the extent that I'm making others uncomfortable by the level of detail that I'm sharing, or that I am verbalizing my inner critic, and then I make it culturally okay to beat up on ourselves. So, moderation and transparency. But then what you talked about as far as not monopolizing the conversation, not being the only voice in the room, is inviting people in to provide their perspectives about that which you've shared. This is my own self-assessment. This is kind of how I got here. What do you think I might be missing? Or what didn't I see?
I agree with that very much. Assessment depends on any sort of assessment depends on data. We have to find the information, the data, quantifiable and qualitative to understand, does this match up with what was desired, what was expected? And that's one of the best ways for leaders to get that data they need is to say, what am I missing? Here's what I think. And then leave it open. And you're creating that role model of I share what I think is working and I ask for feedback. I am open to getting feedback. In our first conversation last year, one of the topics that we spent a good deal of time on was imposter syndrome.
I recall.
Yeah, the inner critic, which that's been my millstone for years and years, if not my whole life. Self-assessment seems like you are unintentionally just making an invitation to the inner critic. What are ways to balance that out, to be intentional and realistic with yourself, be clear about, say, what you're doing very poorly, to really let yourself celebrate what you're doing well, but to get ahead of that nasty voice of the critic?
So first of all, I think it starts with extending yourself some grace. I have found that just changing my mindset to start with the positive stuff first. I find that if I start with what's not working well first, I can come up with a list of 100 things. And it just like spirals on top of one thing after the other.
It does.
So if we start with what has gone well, gosh, that puts my brain in a different spot to pause. I really have to think about it because it's not top of mind for me. But then you have that more positive outlook. And then when you start looking at the list of 100 things that you'd like to be different, maybe you can think about the top 3 things that you want to work on instead of beating yourself up with all 100.
I think that's a good approach. I think using some of that external data too is a way, both positive and constructive, to balance, because yes, there will be things that you know about how you thought and acted that other people won't see because it either was internal or private. And if you have 7 people telling you you did a really good job on that presentation, the voice in your head that's saying you sucked, you messed this up, you should weigh the 7 voices over the one.
Yeah.
And if you're having trouble being really honest with yourself, maybe I did mess up that presentation and 2 people gave me feedback about what I could have done better or different. It's more than one other person. Maybe I really need to evaluate that. Tell my inner critic to take a back seat, but be honest about, yeah, I didn't ask for questions, or I rushed things, or I got all of my data wrong and haven't followed up on that. Whatever it looks like. But use the volume of external feedback as a way to really pay attention to, am I being realistic or am I disregarding what I'm hearing from outside of my own head?
You also use the word realistic.
Yeah.
And from the very beginning, understanding what realistic looks like, not consistently setting unachievable goals for ourselves, because that will just spiral the inner critic, right? I will never be able to accomplish all of the things I set out to achieve. So ensuring that it's realistic. And I like what you said about feedback from those around you. That's also important when you set out to do something in the beginning, right? Having a cheerleading team to say, yes, you can accomplish this, or I think that might be overcommitting. Maybe you should back off a little bit.
Sounds like you've had that happen.
Well, and actually what's coming to mind for me is I remember one of the teams that I work with has a great idea to initiate kind of like a grand rounds. And cool. Their goal was, okay, so we're going to initiate this and we're going to do it every month. And it was like, well, do we really want to do it every month the first year? Or maybe we just want to do it once a quarter for the first year. Maybe if we do it 4 times the first year, we can learn from how is it going, what's working well, what's not working well, and then to be able to set a more reasonable or realistic goal going forward.
Yeah. I like where you've taken us in this conversation, Angela, because we can't talk about assessment of performance or behavior or behavioral aspects of performance without understanding what was the goal or expectation to begin with. So there's a need to be very clear about, what am I trying to accomplish? And what is the line that I'm trying to reach, or the number, or the thing? From a leadership perspective, both for yourself and providing feedback to your team, I'm reminded, some of the words that we've been using reminded me of the model of the SMART goal.
Yes.
Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. I think if we take that not just for goals, but also as a way to assess, be specific, look at the numbers, the measurement, that attainable or achievable is, has this been realistic? Now that it's all over and I have hindsight, was this in fact an attainable goal? What have I learned? Relevant. Did it really line up with what is needed? Or did I end up going wildly off course?
Mm-hmm.
And then time bound is setting those milestones for yourself to do that, whether it's for yourself or somebody on your team. It's also a way to teach people, here's how to give yourself feedback by being specific, by measuring your accomplishment, attainable, achievable, relevant, and timely.
I like that you brought up a different model for us to take a look at. What I liked about the one that you shared at the beginning was that it incorporated so much more qualitative data. And so just being mindful as leaders as we move forward, that both are equally important.
Mm-hmm.
I think in our roles as leadership, it's always difficult to balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I wake up every morning and balance is the key.
Yes.
And so while those measurable, realistic goals are important, we can't get so focused on that we lose the qualitative feedback that we're getting from others, that we lose the, well, great that I accomplished that goal, and did it give me joy? And did it fill my cup?
Mm-hmm.
And so balancing those two things together in that self-assessment, I think, is really important for our psyche.
I agree. I think we're also talking about the fact that performance is holistic. This is something from my HR days that I was constantly a clanging gong about this, that some of it is I've worked in organizations where the HR policies around performance and attendance have always been separate pillars.
Mm-hmm.
So disciplinary or corrective action treated behavioral or outcome problems as performance issues and attendance as its own thing. And that just naturally creates an environment where we think that they're not connected with each other. And then it becomes really easy to parse out different aspects of performance. And I think one of the ways for our own sanity, for our own accuracy, for balance, is to really look, when we say performance, what are all the aspects of it? I think you can probably break it down into some very basic things. There is the outcome, there's behavior, and then presence. Do I show up and how do I show up? And each of those probably has its own nuances, but that's performance as a whole. And if we're going to talk about assessing it, again, we need to understand it. So stuff like, did this fulfill me? Well, ideally performance does encompass the satisfaction that people receive from it. And it's going to be different for every job, every organization. I think that's a really important part of it, and why accurate self-assessment does have to look beyond, I completed 7 projects this year.
Yeah. Kate, when you were talking about the different components of performance, what is the right frequency? Is there a frequency for self-assessment? Is it something I do after every work activity? Is it something I do after every work day? How often do we self-assess?
I am going to give you the organizational development professional's favorite answer. It depends. Everything. It depends.
Great answer.
It could be after every work activity. I would say, especially if you're in a new role with new responsibilities, in a new organization, if you're maybe getting toward the end of a career or a project or something, more frequency is going to be helpful. I mean, we know that annual assessments are flawed. Like, doing it once a year is never a good thing. We owe more frequent assessment and feedback to our employees. We owe it to ourselves as well. One of the practices that I've heard of being common among kind of like the titans of industry, if you will. You'll hear about this occasionally, of how these, these 7 CEOs, this is one of their secrets. It's an end of the day journaling process.
Yeah.
That's one way to do it. And if you're doing it not just to record, here are the people I talked to, the meetings I attended, but really reflecting on the nature of my behavior, the quality of my interactions, that is one way to do it. Even by my lights, that feels kind of overachieving. I don't know that a daily journal is really practical for everyone. I like doing a weekly look back and look forward. I am a planner person, though, so I do a weekly plan for myself. And it's an opportunity to look at, what did I do the week before, the one that's closing out, as I make plans for the other, because it naturally and logically flows in from one to the other. All things. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the good news is we get to decide what's right for us.
Yes.
We get to decide what works for us, and there's not a right and wrong.
Mm-hmm. What does it look like for you?
I admire end of the day journalers. I admire them. My brain is fried at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so
been there.
while I don't do end of the day journaling, I do in the morning showering.
Okay.
So again, this might be an overshare. But in the shower, in the morning, when I've had an opportunity to rest, my
Mm-hmm.
brain is fresh. All of the things that occurred the day before are flooding in.
Okay.
And it allows me the opportunity to say, oh gosh, maybe that didn't go as I had expected it to go yesterday. And how would I have done that differently?
Okay.
What will I do differently moving forward? So in that scenario, that's much more focused on that behavior,
Mm-hmm.
self-assessment, which is not encompassing all performance. And so I can see the way that you defined the components of performance, that there's different frequencies for different components of that, right?
Okay.
So I feel as I'm reflecting on our conversation, I'm doing much more fluid self-assessment of my behavior, whereas the self-assessment of the thing, the project, the outcome is much more like a week by week or a month by month.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, and I think it's also a good way to think about it, because the more frequent assessment should be focused on what's most vital, and we are the instrument of leadership, so we should be looking at what's my tone of voice, what type of clear directions am I giving or not giving. I'm drawing a blank on what some other things could be, where the logistical, the operational pieces, part of starting anything should be including, what is the evaluation for this going to look like? How are we assessing progress?
Yeah.
So the project, the thing, sets its own pace for that. This may be totally a tangent. I'm doing some work right now with a team looking at leader orientation.
Yeah.
And what could a formal curriculum and program look like for them? And that's one of the things, you have to bake in evaluation from the start, both for like the program overall. This is what we're trying to accomplish with it. Reduction of turnover, employee engagement scores, that as a result of having well-oriented leaders, these are all the great things that are going to come from that. Then you also need the opportunity to evaluate individual components, and using that understanding of that there are different levels and different types of assessment that you can do. And obviously I come from a learning and development mindset. I know there are other models in project management, in nursing, but thinking on those different levels of big and day-to-day, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I kind of want to talk a little bit about, so I don't think this is everyone. And there are plenty of people that lack awareness and think they're doing great all the time. They are, one, it's likely they're not people that are going to listen to me, but they're also not necessarily people that are going to change. So I'm kind of curious, instead of talking about the bad actors, the people that think they're fabulous even though they're not they're not fitting the bill, how do we engage with them in a way that's compassionate and kind and doesn't end up pulling us down?
It does make sense. So before I answer, I'm just going to maybe think of, have I ever met any bad actors?
I'm honestly not thinking of anyone in particular.
I'm only doing that so that I can make it real for me on how I would interact with them. You use the word compassionate. How do I interact with them in a kind and a compassionate way? And what I'm picturing is that I'm not even sure that they're going to give me the time to listen anyway.
That's fair. That's fair.
But I think given the opportunity, I think one of the ways that we do that well is from the very beginning, finding and stating and identifying that mutual goal and the mutual ground. We both want the same thing. Do we both want the same thing? Because when we do, regardless of that individual's inability to hear constructive feedback, it allows us to place ourselves in a situation where we can be influential in how we work through that together. So I feel like this is very vague. I'm trying to maybe make it a little bit more specific.
Well, let me say why, because if I'm not careful, this will be entirely a different subject. I think it could help me be clearer and for you to understand why I think this is a topic, is in the context of self-assessment. And if you're going to be a leader that does that, like has a practice of self-assessment, and you are committed to being accurate and balanced and realistic, it is a commitment. It is an endeavor. Because it's much easier to go through life not looking back on the things that didn't go well, or just moving on and not even celebrating. That's the easy path.
Yes.
I think in this context, it's what can we say to leaders that are doing that hard work, but maybe they're working with people that aren't? And how do they not stumble as a result of feeling alone? I'm thinking of some manager trainings that I've done where we're talking about the ideal. Like, here's the best way to do this.
Yeah.
This is the ideal way to lead in this context. And inevitably, you'll get one or two people who are like, that's great, but I don't see my boss doing it, or I don't see my peers doing the thing. And other than saying, yeah, that's just the way it is, deal with it. How do we make the fact that we are going to encounter people that are doing less than we are, who are frustrating to us in some ways in this space? How do we incorporate that so that we don't, this sounds really judgmental, we don't fall to their level, but we also are behaving in a way that shows the value of your practice?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the reasons why I'm struggling to answer this question, last time we talked a year ago, I shared a lot about a journey that we were on that was really focused in on conscious leadership.
Yes.
And the leadership practices, as I think about my growth and development over the last year, the change has been much more focused on me and how I show up and role modeling those behaviors for others, and kind of taking me out of the mindset of comparison.
Okay.
or judging how others are behaving. The work that I'm doing with leadership development, how I'm showing up, that's my work to do. That's about me.
Yes.
And when I do that well, I will notice that other people around me will also begin to do that well.
I think that is the theory. Yes. I I love you pointing out and reminding us that this work is about myself. It's my responsibility. I don't necessarily need to, nor should I be comparing myself. And in the real world, well-meaning leaders who are trying to do the conscious best practice will find themselves surrounded by folks that have no interest in it.
Yes.
And I think incorporating how I show up with and for those people is important in me thinking about my own performance.
Because there's a tendency, I have a tendency to go into a place where I avoid those interactions or I withdraw from that interaction.
Yeah.
Because whether I perceive it's difficult to deal with or whether I perceive that it's harming me, that I just withdraw and I lack engagement.
Yeah. Or the other end of the spectrum, kind of what we could very sloppily classify as virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Too, of, well, I'm doing it right. You should really be thinking about your own performance the way I do.
Yeah.
And that's not going to win anyone over. And it's a behavior that doesn't actually support leading better every day. What if I think I'm being accurate and I've missed the mark? What if my self-assessment is wildly off? When I discover that, because let's assume new information, new data is presented to you and you recognize, wow, I thought I did great and I really messed up. Or the converse of that. How do we deal with it?
The first thing that comes to mind for me, because I missed it in the beginning and something else had to bring it to my attention, was, gosh, I would love the opportunity to talk to one of my colleagues about what happened. In that moment, it's going to be important for me to process and to kind of talk through, like, how did I miss this? Why didn't I consider that? And getting someone, a friend's perspective on that situation is going to help. If I have misassessed, I don't even know that that's a word.
It is now.
If I inaccurately assessed it the first time, what makes me think that I'm going to be able to course correct on my own?
Yeah.
So it's going to be really important for me to reach out and phone a friend.
I like that. I think it's also wildly important to remember that your performance and your identity are not linked.
Oh, gosh.
Which is really hard for those of us that get a lot of our sense of worth from work.
Yeah.
Your performance is not your identity. You have worth entirely separate from any outcome that you do or do not achieve. That's got to be the foundation, the bedrock. Your performance is not who you are. It is an aspect of how you move through the world. And if you remember that, I think it can help getting some of the objectivity that's necessary. That when I'm doing a self-assessment, it's not about my value as a human, as a person on this earth. It's about the behaviors and actions that I've taken in this period of time. I'm still valuable.
I'm just sitting in that for a moment.
It's much easier for me to say than for me to do. I will admit that.
I think it goes back to I'm not going to be good at everything. I'm not going to get everything right.
One of the things you said early on around like ways to do this was starting with what's good. And I had kind of a visceral reaction to that.
Yeah.
One, because you have to look at the critical stuff first. It's my natural bent. And you're absolutely right. It can be so easy to just dive into the bad column. and ignore the good column. I wonder though, and all of this comes back to self-awareness and self-knowledge, if there can be a benefit of saying, I'm not going to get everything right. I can't do it all. Let me start with what I didn't do right, the stuff I didn't manage to accomplish. Not to punish myself, but to agree with myself, to acknowledge the fact that I'm human. What are the 3 things that I wish had gone differently? And limiting. I do think limiting it, because otherwise I'm assuming I'm not the only one, that I would spend 7 hours writing a list of all of my flaws and failures.
Yes.
But if I acknowledge the fact that, yep, I'm human, I'm going to make mistakes, I have made mistakes. There are some things in the last quarter, in the last month, in the last hour that I really messed up. I dropped the ball. Acknowledge it, feel the shame or the fear or the disappointment, and set it aside. Say, yep, that was my human element. Let's see what my better self did. And then just be able to bask in 100% goal for a whole year.
Yes. I love that, Kate. How do we let it go? How do we set it aside?
Maybe set aside is unrealistic. I am reminded of how we talk about all having baggage.
Yes.
And we do. It's just we accrue. There's accretion of memory, experience, knowledge. It is probably unrealistic to say set it aside or leave your baggage at the door or all of that, because we're whole people. We're made up of every experience. So I think it's taking it off of the dashboard, taking it out of center stage, not compartmentalizing, not repressing, but saying, here's something that I wish I had done differently, or I did this to the best of my ability and it was still a failure. Let me break it down. What did I learn? What did go well? What am I going to take forward? And then take the bad stuff and pack it in the right place in your baggage.
As you were talking, I was thinking, maybe we can't set it aside. Maybe we can't let it go. But we can make a conscious decision that I'm not going to let this get in the way of my progress forward. I'm not going to let this paralyze me or negatively impact my ability to move past it.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were talking through, again, that model of self-assessment, when we end with what can the future look like, or what will I do differently moving forward, that enables us to end on an action step.
Yeah,
that will help carry us past the what I didn't do well. So it's interesting that I'm going to start with the positive and you're going to end on the positive. And we're both going to walk away focused on how we move in the future.
This gets back to what you said. The real treat is you get to figure out how you do it for yourself. And like anything that starts with, do I know myself well enough to know what's going to work best? And not to overcomplicate it, but it may not be the same method for every single aspect of your assessment. There could be things like, hey, I have this one really difficult work relationship.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I want is to improve it.
Yeah.
That may require you to be like, okay, I had a confrontation with this person again. Let me acknowledge that. Let me understand. Let me make a choice to do different next time. But in a different sphere, it could be this project went gangbusters. Let's list everything that was fabulous about it, every action that resulted in a win. And instead of focusing in on the 2 flaws and losing sight of the better picture, I've got this list of 100 awesomeness, 100 awesome things. Not awesomeness.
I like awesomeness.
I do too, actually. This is a question that definitely shows that I'm a former HR lady. what do you think a good way to build your documentation to support your self-assessment can be?
Well, you nailed that one, didn't you? It's more difficult for me to see how I have documented my self-assessment of behavior than for me to see how I have documented self-assessment of the more objectable outcomes.
Yeah, I don't think that's something we're necessarily taught. A lot of people intuit it, or we kind of understand, but when we set annual goals or quarterly goals in the workplace, very rarely is there anything about how do I show up?
Mm.
Am I behaving in a way that aligns with our values and my values and priorities? That may be an important thing to explore going forward, is how do we teach leaders that are coming up and through the ranks, and even leaders who are currently in place, to have behavioral goals for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think a good way could be?
Let's pick a behavior.
Okay. What about showing up on time for meetings?
Thank you.
It is a physical, observable thing that can have an impact on you and others. So I have a habit and a reputation for always being 5 minutes late to a meeting.
I think 5 minutes is good. I think I spent the first 10 years of my career, at least 10 years. We even called it, you're on this organization's time. Like,
Yep.
This is just, you're going to be 10 minutes late to everything.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Until I transitioned roles and I started working in a different group, and that was no longer the social, cultural, or acceptable norm.
Mm-hmm.
And the meeting started on time. And when I wasn't there and I missed the first 10 minutes of content, I wasn't going to start asking questions to try to get caught back up.
Yeah.
So that behavior changed really quickly.
Mm-hmm. That's not unique to just one organization.
Yeah.
The church that I grew up in, we talked about it as being this church's time.
Okay.
That everything started like 15 minutes. Yep, we're on blank time.
Okay.
Same thing. It's
Yeah.
a way of, I think it's the normalized.
Yeah.
This is what's normalized for us. We all accept it, even if we don't all like it. But maybe you've gotten feedback from a peer, from a boss. It's like, hey, you're repeatedly late. And you're getting your stuff done, but it's not demonstrating the best behavior.
Mm-hmm.
That people don't feel respected, or we end up having to rehash everything that happened in the first 5 minutes of every meeting because you're always late. Observably, demonstrably late. How do I set a goal for myself?
To stop being late. To only be late to 20% of the meetings. For me, it's really important to be accountable to that goal. Not to myself, but to the other folks as well.
Mm-hmm.
My thoughts automatically go to including it in the weekly look back that you talked about. You talked about doing I want to look back this week and I want to plan for next week and how did I do this week? It could go into the nightly journaling if any of you are nightly journaling, or it can go into the morning shower time.
Yes.
Do you think of documenting behavioral goals? Do you think you've documented self-behavioral goals?
I have in the past.
And is that something that you keep personal, or is that something you share with others?
It depends. Depends kind of on the severity of it or the level of accountability that I feel I need. So about 10 years ago, I feel like I went through, I'm not going to call it a transformation. That's a little too overblown, overstated. But I just became very aware. I had the opportunity to go through some training and just things that were happening at work. I went through some training that made me very aware that a lot of my responses and interactions were driven by self-protection and were showing up as aggression.
Okay.
I had somebody in a position of influence tell me, well, I thought you were just mean. And it was feedback I needed to hear because, yeah, I could be mean. Not intentionally, but because I felt unheard or attacked or undervalued. Inner critic totally flared up.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of going silent, I went on the attack. And I really don't want to be that way in the world.
Yeah.
For that particular set of behaviors and the kind of the internal instigation that was happening, I did start monitoring. Can I notice when I feel defensive, reactionarily defensive? Can I feel it? Can I see it coming out? I remember one day in my daily planner, my daily goal, like my goal for the day, the big overarching one was don't be a jerk. That I did have to make it physical. I had to write it down, make it happen in the real world because I was struggling so much. I was so aware of those bad behaviors and I felt so vulnerable and fragile.
Yeah.
That it was all the time. That
Yeah.
was just how I was responding to everything. And I had trusted colleagues and friends around me that knew that this was something I was trying to do different, do better. So I did make it public. I was transparent about it, and I recorded it for myself. I'm not 100% better. I think that defensiveness is something I'm going to be dealing with my whole life. I can accurately say I'm not as bad anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot more awareness of it. I can see it happening and I can make the choice to stop it now or before it was just untethered.
Yeah.
For me, I needed to have a behavioral goal and a way to monitor it. And because of how I'm wired, a lot of that took place in my daily planner.
Kate, it's so helpful for me to talk through some of these specific examples. As you share your experiences and your stories, it brings to light, oh yeah, that's something that happened to me too. The thing that comes to mind for me as you were sharing that was, gosh, a long, long time ago, we went to some leadership training where we talked about, it was the situational leadership class.
Okay.
And we talked about the 4 styles of leadership. So we have amiable, expressive, directive. Is the last one like executionary maybe, or execute the person that executes? I'm not really sure.
I don't remember.
But we talked about the 4 styles. And in that class, how when you're under stress or under pressure, your style like transitions. So when I'm like by nature, I'm amiable. I want everyone to get along. When I start to feel pressure or stress, that transitions into expressiveness. So then I get loud and a little boisterous sometimes. That really helped me to identify when you were talking about, like, I want to notice the changes in my body. I utilize the changes in my behavior to better understand when I need to take a breath, step back, pause. In my team, you're right, I do share it with others. My team knows that when I get into this mode of being very directive with the work, that's not my natural style. And they know, they're like, Angela, what can we do to help? Take a breath, step back. That's really helped me, I feel like, regulate my behavior, or at least become more aware of where I'm at because my behavior is changing.
Yeah. Here are the 4 styles. I Googled them while you were talking. Pardon for the distraction.
No, you're good.
Directing, coaching, supporting, and delegating.
Okay. Very good.
Yeah. And they have kind of their light and dark sides, don't they?
Yes. Yes, they do. Everything in moderation.
Everything in moderation. Even moderation. When you were talking about making your team aware, it made me think about asking for feedback from
Yes.
your direct reports.
Yes.
And how that can be very double-edged for all parties concerned. I'm really rabid about when an employee gives you, their boss, feedback. The only thing that should come out of your mouth initially,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Angela. That is exactly right, especially if it's feedback you requested. Doesn't matter how you feel about it, say thank you.
Yes.
And then you can say, I appreciate that and I need time to process this.
Yeah.
And go feel excited, overjoyed, or angry and nasty about it. But that feedback, it's that external voice. It's the balance to the inner critic or even the overly enthusiastic inner cheerleader. And if we're going to have accurate self-assessment, we have to be open to external feedback. It's a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah, our topic today was really focused on self-assessment, but we could talk for hours more on colleague feedback, peer feedback, direct report feedback, and feedback from our bosses.
Right. It's actually something I'm doing a collaboration that's just started where another consultant and I are trying to create a guide for feedback that doesn't suck.
I love it.
All those topics.
I love it.
So hopefully that's something that we'll be able to produce in short order for the world.
Yes.
But yeah, assessment and feedback, they're inextricable. That the irony is, if I'm going to assess myself accurately, I really do have to go outside for feedback.
The only other thing I'm still feeling a little unsettled about.
Oh dear.
No, it's not oh dear. Let's go back to this concept of I'm committed to self-improvement. I'm committed to self-assessment for the purposes of improvement. And I'm discouraged by the people around me that don't behave the same.
Thank you. Yeah, that was sloppy before, not because of you, but me.
I don't feel like it was sloppy. I feel like I'm not sure what the right answer is. Even after we kind of chewed it up and spit it out, I'm not sure what the right answer is.
There's so many factors that can play into it.
It's like, don't point out the plank in your neighbor's eye when you have a speck in your own.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. I think that's vice versa. Don't point out the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a plank in your own.
Yes, that is it. Yeah. I think it's, so I know the reason I ask myself questions like that is because I have trained and coached younger leaders, newer leaders who very naturally are doing the comparison game and who get really frustrated, understandably, when they're being taught the quote unquote right way and they see the quote unquote wrong way demonstrated by the people around them and often above them every day. And my heart breaks for that frustration that they feel, because it's real. Right? It just is.
So I'm so glad that we brought this back up.
Okay.
I'm so glad that you talked about younger, newer leaders. It took me back to that moment, a new and a young leader. And I can recall a time that I had my to-do list. I was a nurse manager at the time.
Yeah.
And I think I've shared with you more than once that our nurse managers are amazing, and that nurse managers in healthcare organizations, in my opinion, is one of, if not the most difficult job in a healthcare organization.
I think there have been reports that say nurse manager is possibly the most stressful job anywhere.
They're incredible,
right up there.
Incredible people.
Mm-hmm.
And my to-do list was 3 pages long.
Oh.
And I recall feeling especially overwhelmed that day and sitting in a room. And I was not in tears.
Good.
Until another nurse manager walked in the room and looked down at my paper and flippantly said, "Is that your to-do list?" And my immediate reaction was like, yes. And don't you have one too? And that was the moment that I burst into tears, because I had this realization that, like, I'm trying to do all the things and I'm trying to keep up and I'm working really hard. And why are you being so flippant about this? Because I'm working so hard. And so that's what I pull out of our conversation. It's not as much about, comparing myself to others. It's, I'm working really hard. I'm getting tired of how hard I'm working. And how are you not struggling the same way that I'm struggling? And so it's the how we help each other kind of in that journey, versus a mindset of where I was coming to it in the beginning was like I'm doing a better job than you're doing. Pick up the slack.
No, and it could be very easy to fall into that, I think.
Yeah.
Talking about nurse managers, one of the hardest jobs in the world, that middle manager in nursing. The fact of the matter is, managing people is one of the hardest jobs out there.
Yeah.
It's just complicated in nursing.
People are messy.
Oh my goodness, right? Awful. People are awful. Gotta love them. I want to acknowledge how difficult leading is. And what you said, that exhausted from trying to be better. Leading is hard enough. And when you layer on this whole ideal state of I'm actively self-aware, that I'm actively paying attention to my impact on others, I'm aware of you, I'm practicing empathy, I'm reviewing how I'm showing up every day, I'm looking at my operational strategic goals, in addition to whatever your day-to-day looks like. That is a lot. And it is sometimes easier to just go through the day, do it yourself, and not look back. And that's okay. Sometimes that's all you get to do for a day. And I don't want anyone listening this to think that if you're not conducting a regular self-assessment that evaluates every aspect of your performance on a frequent, regular basis, you're a bad leader. And that's not the case.
Absolutely.
Yes, it is a mandate that you assess yourself. Good leaders pay attention to their performance, their very own performance. A large part of that is behavior. You have to do it. And it doesn't mean you have to do it every day. It doesn't mean you have to do it perfectly. It doesn't mean that you have to do it tomorrow. Sometimes doing the bare minimum is magnificent. And that's something I think that has to be incorporated into this. That as a practice of accurate self-assessment for leaders, is the goal is never perfection.
Yeah.
The goal is doing a little better every day.
Yeah. 2 lessons or 2 thoughts that I'm taking away from this most recent conversation.
Yes, please.
I ride Peloton sometimes. And one of Hannah Corbin's favorite sayings is encouraging you, the rider, just by showing up. I think her statement is, you're already doing so much more than everybody else who's still on the couch.
Yes.
And it's just that incremental progress, one foot in front of the other. It might not be perfection, but I'm continuing to show up and I'm continuing to try and I'm continuing to do better. The second takeaway that I have, I just all of a sudden got in my emotions about those young leaders, those that are new to leadership, and just reflecting back on what that was like is so visceral for me.
Oh, yeah.
And it reminds me the day that somebody told me, so it was this, 3-page to-do list. The day that somebody told me I didn't actually have to do everything and write everything down, and what it was like to feel empowered, to be able to choose I'm a leader. What is the work that I'm going to do? What is the work that I'm going to spend my time on? And what am I going to let go of?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not expected as a leader to do it all. And that was freeing for me in a totally different way.
I can see that. Definitely see that. Do you have any other takeaways you want to share?
I think I want to be more aware of setting goals around behavior and doing some self-assessment of behavior. I think it's very easy for us in a metric-driven world, in a goal-oriented setting, to measure ourselves consistently with those objective outcomes. And I really appreciated our conversation around the behavioral goals. I feel like I do behavioral self-assessment. Like I said, I think that's my every morning shower time. But really setting some goals around how I want to see my behavior improving and how I want to show up as a leader differently.
For me, it all boils down to intentionality, deliberateness in the best way. I know deliberation gets a bad rap. It's seen as slow or unpleasant. But if there is intention and thought and mindfulness behind the choices that you're making, both in how you go through each day and then how you look back at it, that's the best case. Because again, it's not perfection. I am not advocating for people to keep ridiculous records of themselves.
Color-coded spreadsheets.
Well, that's acceptable. I mean, I have a color coding system that is locked in, and it can be as organized and as loose as it suits you. And that's really what it comes down to, is, are you doing what works for you in this space? You understand yourself, your strengths, your needs, your preferences, your proclivities well enough that you have a system to do this. And I need to start with the positive things, or I need to acknowledge that I messed up, that I am going to make mistakes. And if I can get that out of the way, I'm free then to celebrate, or something entirely different that I can't even imagine in the moment. But if you've taken the time to really understand yourself, to be conscientious, and to consider your own needs, you're capable of doing this. And you do it to improve yourself, to improve your leadership, not just because, but because your employees deserve it. Employees deserve leaders that are doing the hard work of getting better.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, that's my takeaway. That it's not necessarily the way you do it, the frequency, the sequencing. It's, am I clear that I do this so I can be better, I can be more fulfilled at my work, and that I'm leading in a way that really benefits the people that look to me for leadership. Period. End of story.
As a meaningful summary.
Oh, I thank you.
Before I go, I want to congratulate you on your success over the last year. You have so much to be proud of, as demonstrated in your accurate self-assessment. And I wish you much success as you move forward to pursue consistency.
Thank you. Not just for today, but for your ongoing support and friendship. I appreciate you giving your time and talent to participate.
It feels weird to hear you thank me for my time and talent, because I feel like I show up here like to get better. Like this was like a leadership development session for me. So thank you for allowing me to continue to learn from you every time we're together.
Always mutual, friend. Thank you. Thanks for joining me in the comfy chairs, and many thanks to Angela. Again, as a way to celebrate our first year of hanging out in the comfy chairs, I'm offering a complimentary Everything Disc assessment for one listener. Here's how to enter. 1. Leave a review on any platform where you stream podcasts. 2. Visit Onetwentythree.ltd.com and share your email. That's it. Look for the links that you'll need in the show notes. Everyone who completes these 2 steps between July 16th and August 13th, 2024, will be entered in a drawing. I'll use the email you provide to communicate results no later than August 23rd. And in addition to leaving a rating, please consider subscribing or sharing with others. You'll find Comfy Chairs updates and other thoughts on leading and learning at Instagram at Onetwentythree Limited. That's Onetwentythree Ltd. Thank you.